a professor who usually lectures about the kinds of books that nobody reads unless they get assigned in class, books that are at least 200 years old. But I'm here today to talk to you about pornography. And most porn these days isn't even in books. So how does somebody like me get interested in pornography? Well, it was one of those moments when scholarship and personal life converge. Because, in fact, pornography was invented in the period that I study and teach, the 18th century. And yet, I really didn't get interested in it until, as a single adult in the internet age, I found that more than one of my significant relationships was, let's say, fatally disrupted by porn use. And then I was asked to write a cultural critique of the whole phenomenon of internet porn. And I found it actually really painful work to do at first, but the more I forced myself to confront the material and analyze it and try to understand it, the more it actually became a healing process for me. One reason is because I found out how so not alone I am with these kinds of problems. Every time I tell someone that I'm writing about internet porn, every single person says, "Oh yeah, I know a marriage that just broke up over that." And I personally know several of them. And while I'm hearing all these personal stories from people, I'm also doing my background research and finding out that these kinds of problems that people are experiencing have actually reached epidemic proportions in our society. And this is well documented by an army of social scientists, which I am not, including sociologists, psychologists, and also journalists. So I'm hoping that by coming here and talking about some of the understanding that I've been able to reach about pornography through the last three years of research, that I could also maybe share some of my healing process with anyone out there who might also be feeling helpless or alone or overwhelmed by something that's become so ubiquitous. In fact, porn is so everywhere now that we hear a lot about porn culture, which means that things that used to be specific to pornography are now so mainstream and generalized in our culture that we hardly even notice anymore. They just seem normal. But that's actually where I'm finding an opportunity to create a disruption. But before I can explain that, we need to define our terms. The first attempt, it's really hard to talk about pornography because it's very obviously emotional, it's controversial, but the worst thing is that nobody even really seems to know what it is. One of the first attempts to define it comes from the period in which it was still really new. Great philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. 200 years later, this is how far we got. So, as you can see, both of these definitions are kind of vague, and yet both of these two brilliant thinkers focus on really the same thing, and that is that pornography tends to produce a particular kind of response in a reader or viewer. So keeping that in mind, I still thought that we really need a sharper definition of pornography in order to be able to think and talk meaningfully about it. So this is a definition that I've been finding good to think with. Pornography is a sexually explicit representation that circulates and eroticizes use and non-consent. So let's unpack that for just a second. It's a sexually explicit representation. Super important to keep in mind that porn and sex are not the same thing. Porn is in fact just one way of representing sex. It's also a type of representation that circulates. It's a commodity too, not just a representation. And that means that it's a thing that you can take away with you to your private space and use it. Finally, it eroticizes use and non-consent. This is the trickiest but most interesting part. Now, non-consent does not necessarily or always mean rape. It can, but typically pornography conveys the idea that bodies can be used to create that response that Rousseau and Potter Stewart noticed without any other person's consent, desire, or pleasure being essential to that. Now, everyone who's ever tried to define pornography has always recognized that not every sexually explicit representation is actually pornographic. They've always tried to draw a distinction between pornography and erotica. But these days we tend to forget that distinction because pornography has become so pervasive in our mainstream culture. We just tend to think that practically anything could be porn, certainly all sexually explicit material, but we even talk about food porn or real estate porn. So I'm trying to draw a sharper distinction that would actually enable us to think about what's going on here and what pornography really is. So just to give you a couple of examples of where I'm trying to draw that line between pornography and erotica. The Stone Age figurine on one side is the reason why some people will say, well, pornography, it's been around since the days of the cavemen. It's always been with us, it's part of human nature, it always will be with us. But if you compare it to this modern-day sex doll, you'll see that these things are not quite the same. The sex doll has holes that are clearly designed for use, and that use is meant to be erotic. Whereas the Paleolithic figurine, it's not so obvious in what way this could be used to produce some kind of sexual response. In fact, she doesn't have any holes. She doesn't even have a mouth. In fact, none of these 150 or so Paleolithic figurines that are like this have any holes whatsoever. So clearly, porn by this stricter definition, this sharper definition, really hasn't been around all that long. In fact, it's been around approximately since the days of the Marquis de Sade, about 200 years or so. So that's one reason I chose an illustration from one of his novels in my next set of examples. Now, both of these ladies just happen to be naked and upside down. But you might be surprised as to which one of them recently got censored as pornographic on the internet. It's not the one who's being tortured, raped, and murdered. It's actually the one who is clearly just doing her own thing and taking charge of circulating her own image. She's the one who had her Instagram account shut down recently because of this image, whereas nobody really seems to mind who sees this illustration from the Marquis de Sade. It's just out there for anyone to look at. So while I'm on the subject of the Marquis de Sade, there's an important question that some people ask. They'll say, well, okay, what's wrong with eroticizing non-consent? Some people actually enjoy fantasies of bondage or even rape. And in fact, that's true. And people who participate in what's called bondage, discipline, and sadomasochism actually spend a lot more energy and care making sure that they've explicitly drawn and expressed everyone's limits of consent, much more than practically anybody else. So what's going on there is actually quite different from what's going on in the original Marquis de Sade's works, as we can see in this illustration. I can assure you this lady is not consenting. She's actually being killed. I think one of the things that this sharper definition can do for us is to help us draw a clearer line between erotica that celebrates sexuality and pornography that eroticizes use and non-consent. And that latter, stricter definition really accurately describes everything that I saw in 3 years of research on the internet. And that, I think, is what's giving rise to some of these harms that people are experiencing. But drawing that line between what's pornography and what's erotica allows us to talk about the harms of pornography, but also not necessarily to reject or condemn all sexually explicit material. So another thing that this definition can do for us is to help us understand something else that is otherwise, I think, pretty inexplicable, and that's the widespread appeal of child pornography. You might not be aware of it, but it's more widespread than most people think. For example, in 2003, one single sting operation by the British government busted 6,000 people of every possible walk of life on charges of child pornography possession. The FBI, meanwhile, just in the first decade of the internet's widespread use from 1996 to 2005, initiated 15,556 separate investigations of child pornography. And they haven't yet published the stats for the current decade, but there's constantly in the news a new FBI bust of some child porn ring. So I think it's pretty hard for most of us to understand how that kind of thing could appeal to so many people until we understand that what pornography does in general is to eroticize use and non-consent. And children are those people who are defined as incapable of giving consent to sexual activity. So to make it seem sexy to use their bodies to achieve this response of arousal is actually right at the very core of what pornography in general is doing. It's not qualitatively different. It's more extreme, perhaps, but it's not a totally different thing. It's at the center and not at some fringe sicko margin of the whole enterprise. So all of the examples I've been giving so far focus on how pornography eroticizes the non-consent of those whose bodies get used in porn. But I also want to point out that it frequently compromises the agency and consent of people who use porn as well. For example, if we think about, most of us will be disturbed at the idea of 13-year-old boys being used to make pornography. And yet, so many of us just kind of nudge and wink when we hear about 13-year-old boys being exposed to pornography. And yet, as children, they're equally incapable of meaningful consent to either using or being used. It's true that as users of porn, they're not being physically violated in the same way, and yet their minds and their capacities for sexual response and relationships are being profoundly affected. And one glaring piece of evidence for that is the surprising current epidemic of erectile dysfunction among teenage boys, of all people, many of whom have managed unwittingly to condition themselves to respond only to porn and not to people. And many of them, a surprising number of teenage boys and also grown men, are currently in treatment for this very condition. So I think that as a society, we're extremely unfair to our boys and men. We regularly fail to protect our boys, and we also regularly insult our men by whenever we assume that they are incapable of resisting pornography, that somehow they are not capable of defining their own, withholding their consent to become users of porn. And that's a very sexist and demeaning assumption, and I don't see any reason to think it's true either. So I've talked about a lot of problems, and I promised some hopeful thoughts. So what could be some solutions? One thing I definitely want to emphasize is that censorship is not the solution. It just creates porn. Censorship is really what produces pornography. So instead of censoring porn, I want to propose that we all try to disrupt porn culture. And one example of doing that is the Instagram photograph, for example. It turns out that by circulating images that are erotic instead of pornographic, and I could name other examples, but I don't have time, those actually disrupt porn culture. But I'll leave you with a reassuring idea. In case you're not feeling so comfortable with the idea of disrupting porn culture by circulating erotic images of yourself, and I certainly don't. We can still all disrupt porn culture simply by clarifying consciously the lines of our own consent, whether it's about our consent to be porn users, or our consent to expose our kids to porn, or our consent to participate in porn culture. So the bottom line is define the lines. That's what it means to be a consenting adult.